Welcome to your favourite day of the week, everyone, where today we'll be going through some of the biggest military blunders in history. Now, any fool could lose a battle, especially when starting at a weaker position than the opponent. But it takes someone real special to have the advantage and then squander it. So today our whiteboard's gone through a bit of a glow up and has been transformed into the whiteboard of tactics, so I can take you through the battle and show you how it unfolded and where it was won and lost. And if you do recognise this battle setup for our number 1 battle, top marks to you. Leave it in the comments down below and you'll get a gold star if it was right. So because these battles were such big points in history, realistically they could each have a video about 20 to 30 minutes long on each of them individually. So I've decided to condense them down into this one video, and if you want to skip to a specific battle, the timestamps will be on the video. So before we do begin our military blunder list, make sure you do like the video if you enjoy the content, and if you haven't yet, please do subscribe so you do not make these same military blunders in future. Anyway, on to our list of 4 of the biggest military blunders and defeats in history. Number 1, the Romans at the Battle of Cannae. This setup's Cannae, by the way. If you did get Cannae, top marks, you get a gold star. So, this battle could be described as one of the most humiliating defeats ever for one side and one of the greatest tactical victories ever for the other. In 218 BC, Hannibal of Carthage crossed the Alps with a large force of which some suggest up to 90,000 men, 12,000 cavalry and 40 elephants to invade Rome. So the story goes that Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants. But he wasn't just a zookeeper on holiday, he had a sizable force to back him up, and he meant business. By the time Cannae rolled around 2 years later, in 216 BC, Hannibal's force stood around 50 to 60,000 men. The elephants, however, had no record of fighting in Cannae, so it was presumed they were all dead at this point. I knew some of you would have asked about the elephants, well, they're all dead. In the 2 years Hannibal was in Italy, the Romans suffered 2 great defeats at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, and they thought, bloody hell chaps, this Hannibal bloke's a real problem. What are we going to do? Well, they'd done what any normal person done and raised the greatest army Rome had ever assembled, around 86,000 men. They had to crush him now. The typical style of ancient warfare at the time was to try and overwhelm your enemy in the centre and pour more and more troops into it, which is exactly what the Romans tried to do at Cannae, but Hannibal had a far more complex strategy in mind. He knew the Romans would fight like this, as they had always done, and he set up his troops in a tactical position to try and counter this. He took their greatest strength of their numbers and turned it into their biggest weakness, which leads us onto our whiteboard. So here we are now with the whiteboard of tactics, and this is how the battle was roughly set up. The Romans went for depth in their lines in order to overpower Hannibal's infantry in the centre, as previously mentioned. Hannibal, however, had a far more complex strategy in mind. He set his men up in this crescent shape, with himself fighting in the front lines for a particular reason. As well as himself in the front lines, he also had his Gauls and Spanish infantry. See, the Romans would have seen the Gauls and Spanish in the front lines and thought these were weak fighters, increasing their confidence. However, not Hannibal's men, these were battle-hardened veterans, extremely disciplined, and for a particular reason as well. As well as the veterans on the front, he had his veteran African infantry on the wings, for a particular reason again. Hannibal's strategy had to be executed perfectly. The Romans, overconfident as they were, charged the centre, straight in to Hannibal's trap. Hannibal, this is why he was on the front line, had to feign a controlled retreat. He had to have his men extremely disciplined, which is why the veterans were on the front. He had to control his men in a backwards march, bringing the enemy further and further into his lines. This is why the veterans were there. He couldn't have any new recruit doing this. They would lose discipline and ruin the plan. The Romans poured deeper and deeper into Hannibal's lines. They thought they had the enemy on the run, and the desire to destroy Hannibal's force was too much. Men from the back of the Roman lines lose cohesion and dived straight in to Hannibal's trap. The battlefield started to resemble something like this, with the Romans pushing deeper and deeper in, and Hannibal's line beginning to resemble a crescent U shape. In the dust that was kicked up from the battle, the Romans either did not see the African infantry or decided to ignore them. This is why the veterans were there as well. They had to remain disciplined. Any new recruit could have just charged into battle, ruining the plan, or ran away, seeing the superior numbers of the Romans. So, when the line started to resemble a crescent shape, the African infantry, now fresh, charged the Romans in the flanks, performing a U-shaped manoeuvre on them, pincering them. Earlier in the battle, Hannibal's cavalry had seen off the Roman cavalry and had free reign over the battlefield to do whatever they want. So in this position, what do you do with your cavalry? They've got free reign over the battlefield. Do you have a little equestrian event in the middle of the battlefield? You don't. You charge straight into the back of the Roman lines, and the Romans were now encircled. It became more and more compact, and the Romans could barely swing their swords. Because when the Roman men die in the centre, they have to fill in the gaps and they become more and more compact. It is said in this death circle, roughly 600 Romans died per minute, and the total casualties for the battle was roughly 60,000 Romans. The bloodiest day in Roman history. There is reports of Roman men digging holes in the ground and putting their heads in to suffocate themselves to escape the battle. It was that grim. So after the Battle of Cannae, there was a national day of mourning to remember these fallen soldiers, because it was said that everyone in Rome would have been related to or knew one of these soldiers that died in the death circle. By the time Hannibal had been in Italy for 2 years, it is said that 1/5 of the entire Roman population, male over 17, had died, and I think it's roughly 2.15% of the entire Roman population died in this circle. It was a grim day and one of the bloodiest days in Roman history. Which leads us on to number 2 military blunder. It's the Romans again. Number 2, the Romans at Carrhae. In 53 BC, Marcus Linnus Crassus had been enticed by the prospect of military glory and riches and decided to invade Parthia without the official consent of the Senate. Advised by a man called Ariames, who was on the Parthian payroll, he marched 40,000 troops deep into the desert, where he encountered a small Parthian force. Crassus was informed of the Parthians' presence close by, and while advancing, came to a river. With their forces weakened by the blistering hot heat and thirst, Crassus was advised to make camp next to the river and allow the army to rest before continuing the chase the next day. Crassus, however, was convinced to attack the Parthians immediately by his son Publius. Tired, thirsty and hungry, the Roman soldiers failed to fight well, which now leads us into the whiteboard. So we're here now again with the whiteboard of tactics. Crassus had set his Romans up in this square formation. It lacked mobility, but it protected their flanks. The Parthian force was made up of entirely horse archers and cataphracts, which were heavy cavalry, led by a general called Serena. The point of this Parthian force was just to distract and delay the Romans, but what it achieved was far superior. Serena saw this square and thought a charge in with his cataphracts would be far too dangerous, so he decided to pepper the Romans with arrows to begin with. If the Romans decided to advance towards the horse archers, they were too tired and too slow to catch them, and the horse archers would think, not for me, I'm off, little gallop away. They couldn't catch them, and then the cataphracts would come straight in and destroy the Roman lines. So the Romans, taking casualties from the arrows, decided to form a testudo formation. I don't have a shield to demonstrate what this looks like, so I'll leave it on screen now. The testudo formation effectively defended them from missiles and took less casualties than they were. At this point, the testudo formation protects from missiles, but it's really weak in combat. So the cataphracts charged straight into this testudo formation, causing absolute chaos among the Romans. The Romans had to respond to this, and by the time they loosened formation back into battle formation to defend against these cataphracts, the cataphracts had thought, I've done enough here, I'm out again. Horsey off, they've gone. And horse archers straight back in. It was a disaster for the Romans, really. There's accounts of Roman shields being pinned to limbs and arrows going through the feet of the Romans and pinning them to the ground. There's a lot of arrows around, basically. Crassus's last hope was that the Parthian forces would run out of arrows, but he saw they were being supplied by thousands and thousands of camels. I'm not sure how many, there's no number. So they're getting supplied with arrows. The arrows aren't going to stop. So what Crassus done is he sent his son Publius out with a force of cavalry, archers and some legions to try and chase off the Parthian forces. The Parthian forces thought, I'm not fighting them here. They run all the way back to their camp. And by the time Publius's forces were far enough away from Crassus's forces so they couldn't see each other or couldn't help each other, the Parthians surrounded Publius's forces and absolutely slaughtered them. Publius, in the shame of battle, with the shame of defeat, decided to fall on his own sword, which is a Roman term for committing suicide in the shame of losing a battle, and it's a way to regain honour. So Crassus at this point, a few hours have gone by, is wary of his son's whereabouts, like what happened to him, how did the battle go, and he decided to form a general advance towards the way his son went. It was at this point he saw his son's head mounted upon a spike, and then the Parthian forces surrounded Crassus's forces. They only escaped because it became nightfall, and they retreated to a nearby town. The next day, Crassus went to negotiate with the Parthians, but a bit of ruckus broke out, and they killed him and all his generals. In Crassus's blunder of chasing the Parthians through the desert, going a different route. There was many routes Crassus could have took for this, and he chose the quickest route. I think he was going to attack a town, I'm not too sure. He chose the quickest route through the desert, advised by a person on the Parthian payroll, and he got absolutely annihilated. In his blunder, he lost 20,000 Roman men, 10,000 more were sold to captivity and slavery, he lost himself, and he lost his son. It is said that the Parthians took one of the prisoners of war, who most looked like Crassus, dressed him up in woman's clothes in order to humiliate him, and paraded him through their towns. It was a disaster for the Romans. Which leads us on to our third blunder, the Romans again. I swear it's the last Romans one. Number 3, the Romans at Teutoburg Forest. Yes, I know 3 Roman defeats in a row, but they were around for a long time. They were bound to make some mistakes, and they knew if they lost in battles, they'd end up in a Jamie's Day YouTube video 2,000 years later for how interesting those battles were. Across the Roman history, few defeats left such an impact as Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Quintilius Varus was assigned leadership of a Roman force in order to consolidate the new province of Germania. Varus's rule of Germania was cruel and tyrannous, causing dislike of him among the Germanic tribes. At the time, Varus was being advised by a Germanic chieftain named Arminius, and it was Varus's biggest mistake to trust him. In secret, behind Varus's back, Arminius formed an alliance between all of the once disorganised Germanic tribes in hatred of the Romans and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. Between 6 and 9 AD, the Romans had to redeploy 8 of their 11 legions in Germania to crush a rebellion in the Balkans, leaving Varus with only 3 legions. Arminius knew this was the right time, and he informed Varus of a revolt that had broken out nearby. Varus decided to stomp out this uprising immediately, and was led by Arminius on a route through Teutoburg Forest, which was unfamiliar to the Romans, in order for an ambush to be sprung. Which leads us into the whiteboard. So we're here now again with the whiteboard of tactics. Varus has been led through Teutoburg Forest on the unfamiliar route by his advisor Arminius, who was in league with the Germanic tribes. Despite being an unfamiliar route, Varus did not scout ahead, and if he did, he might have saw what was lying in wait for him. He also ordered his troops not to march in battle formation, which I assume is to get to the revolt quicker. As well as not being in battle formation, there was a lot of camp goers in Varus's line, which includes women, children, and those not able to fight. At this point, Arminius knew that ambush was lying in wait, so he left under the guise to rally more Germanic support for Varus, and he went straight into the forest, and as soon as he was out of sight, he came straight back down to the Roman army, leading thousands of Germanic troops. See, Arminius was raised in Rome and educated there, so he knew exactly how the Romans fought and told all the Germanic tribes and how to counter them. The Romans were extremely unprepared and were being attacked from both sides, and it was an absolute slaughter. The Roman line stretched roughly 9.3 miles to 12.4 miles all the way, or 15 to 20 kilometres, so anything happening at the front of the battle wouldn't be known at the back of the line. And any command a general would want to get up the line, it wouldn't be able to be achieved, and the cohesion would be absolutely ruined. It is said of the 15 to 20,000 Roman forces in this line, almost all of them died, and in contrast, the Germanic tribe numbers were quite unknown, but it's said around 15,000 and that casualties are extremely minor. Varus and his generals fell on their own sword for the shame of the battle in order to regain honour, and it is said that Emperor Augustus repeatedly cried, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The 3 legions numbers that had been killed that day were never used again, which is in contrast to the legions that had been destroyed prior. Those numbers for the legions were used again. Teutoburg Forest is seen as one of the most impactful defeats in Roman history, as it brought an end to the triumphant expansion under Emperor Augustus and dissuaded the Romans going further and further into Germania, which is seen as one of the most important events in European history. Which brings us on to our 4th and final battle now, which isn't the Romans this time, it's the French. Number 4, the Battle of Agincourt. I couldn't end the video without a great English victory, could I? In 1415, an English army led by Henry V was marching across France when it was confronted by a larger force of Frenchmen under Charles d'Albret. Henry and his men were trying to march to the port of Calais, an English stronghold in northern France at the time, when they are blockaded by the French army. The English had little to no food, had marched 260 miles or 420 kilometres in 2.5 weeks, were suffering from sicknesses such as dysentery, and were greatly outnumbered by well-equipped French men-at-arms. The French army blocked Henry's way of safety to Calais, and delaying the battle for Henry would only further weaken his tired army and allow more French reinforcements to arrive. The English were greatly outnumbered, and all d'Albret needed to do was block the route and avoid the battle. But when Henry advanced with flying flags and men chanting, d'Albret took this as an insulting challenge and attacked. Which leads us to the whiteboard. So we're here now for one final time with the whiteboard of tactics. If you have made it this far in the video, thank you so much. And if you just clicked on it to learn about the Battle of Agincourt, you're in for a real treat. So, the French and English had set up their forces in somewhat this position. The French being the black units and the English being the red units. The English men at arms were here and the archers were on the flanks hiding in the forest somewhat. The ground between the French and the English was extremely muddy and slippy, and the French units were advancing. They had heavy armour on, weighing roughly 23 to 27 kilograms, or 50 to 60 pounds. This was extremely heavy for them, and they advancing with mud saying it come up to their knees in some point. More and more clay was sticking to the French armour, making them heavier and heavier. They were advancing towards the English. Advancing in the mud would have been generally exhausting, but on top of that, they had the English longbowmen firing on top of them with arrows. See, the French advance would have been extremely slow in their heavy armour and would have been extremely exhausting. The French would have to get through the mud and maybe walk around or over one of their fallen comrades who had died to an arrow in the eye, or an arrow to the knee. So, the French are advancing through the mud, it's extremely heavy, and the longbows are coming at them. An arrow wouldn't actually penetrate the main body of the chest armour, the thickest point, but it could get lodged in one of the weak points, say under the arm, this bit of the arm, I don't know what it's called, under the knee, or it could slip off the chest and get lodged in a point. If you want to see a video of recreating an arrow into armour, Todd's Workshop made a great video of armour accurate to the time, arrows accurate to the time, and bows accurate to the time to test if the armour would get penetrated. It wouldn't. But the weak points of the armour might get penetrated slightly. The main point wouldn't though. So one of the weak points of the armour was the helmet for the French knights, because of the eye sockets and the breathing holes made the front of the face quite weak. So while the French were advancing through the mud, exhausted in mud, getting arrows rained on them, they also had to tip their visors down like this so the arrows wouldn't land in their face and give them a nice hole in their chin or something. This would have limited their vision and breathing. Would have been horrible. So the French knights were advancing. The longbow's range was roughly 200 to 300 metres effective range. So a 300 metre walk in heavy armour through heavy mud while your friends are dying left and right of you, being rained on by arrows, would have been extremely horrible for the French. The French did have cavalry. They didn't see these archers and no, I'm going to let these guys fire us. They did have cavalry. They did try to stop them. But the archers were in woodland on either side of the battle and protected by stakes, so the cavalry couldn't charge on them. The French knights are advanced and extremely exhausted, and by the time they reached the English front line, they were absolutely knackered. Imagine you've just gone on a marathon, you've just run your marathon, and then they tell you, hang on, here's a sword, here's a shield, go and fight these English knights. They haven't run a marathon, but you have. You'd be heartbroken, you'd be absolutely heartbroken. So the French knights are now here extremely exhausted, and they wouldn't even be able to lift their swords at this point. They'd be like, oh, I've got mud on myself, but your life's on the line, you have to pull those last strengths of energy onto you. As well as being extremely exhausted fighting the English, you'd also have arrows coming in from your side. You'd have a risk from the front, a risk from the side. It would be horrible. I can't even imagine. The movie Henry V, or I think it's The King, called The King, depicts the Battle of Agincourt, and it's muddy there. It would be horrible. That everyone's slipping and sliding. You're getting absolutely mauled by the English footmen. So if you were at the front line, you got knocked down, you're in your heavy armour, you couldn't get back up, you were so tired. You'd sink into the mud, and there's accounts of French knights suffocating in their helmets. It would be a horrible way to go. But unlike our battle earlier, where the Parthian force didn't run out of arrows, the English longbowmen did. But the English longbowmen had extremely light armour on, and were extremely mobile. The mud didn't affect them as much as these heavily armoured knights, so they could run around in the mud, have a little play mud fight. But they didn't do that. When they ran out of arrows, they charged into the French knights with their hatchets, machetes and daggers. See, at this point, all armour wouldn't be completely impenetrable. It would have weak points, as suggested by the arrows earlier, where you could little stab your dagger under the armpits. So a French knight would get knocked down, too exhausted to get back up, and an English longbowman, would get his dagger, see on the ground, see, oh, I've got a little eye hole here. Oh, that'd be enough to fit a dagger through. You'd get a dagger straight into your eye. So as well as you were suffocating, there'd be a dagger poking in your eye. It would be horrible. And it was an absolute slaughter for the French knights. The French started with a force of around 14 to 15,000 men and lost, I think it's around 6 to 8,000 of them, with a lot of high nobility Frenchmen being captured and killed. The English started with a force of around 6 to 8,000 men as well. And they lost, there's reports saying, not even triple digits of men, but sources believe it's above 100 and between 100 and 600 men. It was an absolute slaughter for the French. And this is where the superiority story of the English longbow mainly comes from. It's the biggest propaganda piece for the longbow ever. So if any longbow companies are watching, just recreate the Battle of Agincourt. You'd get a lot of advertising from it. So if they were selling longbows, they'd get a lot of advertising revenue from it. It's like the primetime TV for them. So I think that's the end. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, I think that's the end of it. I've just checked my notes. I think I've gone through everything. So if you have watched the video this far, thank you so much. And if you've just turned in for Agincourt, thank you so much as well. I tried to do the battles in one take on my whiteboard to get a lot of information in at once, so if I have stumbled over my words at some point or misinterpreted the information or got it a bit wrong, I do apologise. I try and correct it in editing. So thank you so much for watching. If you have got this far, this would have been a longer video than usual, and I hope you've all enjoyed it so much. This whiteboard is being put to very good use, and remember, do not run with scissors. I've been Jamie's Day, your favourite day of the week, and this was the whiteboard of tactics indicating some of the biggest military blunders in history. I hope you all have a great day. I'll see you all next time. Peace.